1991, Australia suffered its worst recession since the Great Depression. GDP fell by 1.7%, employment declined by 3.4%, and the unemployment rate rose to 10.8%. However, after the recession, Australia experienced over 20 years of continuous economic expansion, the longest in its history. GDP growth averaged around 4% annually, driven by deregulation, privatization, and labor market reforms that increased productivity and competitiveness. But that success was not to last. In 2023, Australia found itself in a very tough spot. For only the third time in the past 40 years, the country entered what is called a per capita recession. This means that, on average, each person's share of the economy got smaller. This was bad news for many Australians, as their wages dropped to levels they hadn't seen in decades. When Australians were asked about their biggest concern, the overwhelming response was the cost of living. This worry makes sense, considering that over the last few decades, Australia has seen one of the most significant housing booms in history. Imagine, since 1973, house prices in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne have skyrocketed, increasing 36 times. Now, Sydney holds the dubious honor of being the second most unaffordable place to live in the world. But how did things get so out of hand? To understand this, let's take a closer look at Australia's economic challenges. You see, to buy a typical home in Melbourne today, a family needs to earn at least $180,000 per year. In Sydney, the required income jumps to a staggering $270,000 per year. Compare these figures to the median household income of around $110,000 in both cities, and it's clear that owning a home is out of reach for many Australians. Some might think that this housing crisis is only a problem in Sydney or Melbourne, but that's not true. Since 2020, house prices in other major cities like Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth have also surged by over 55%, while wages have only grown by about 13%. This discrepancy makes homeownership increasingly difficult, especially for young Australians who haven't had the chance to benefit from the earlier rise in home values. Many young people are constantly struggling to catch up, and as a result, home ownership rates for those under 34 have dropped by nearly 25%. For those who can't afford to buy a home and turn to renting instead, the news isn't much better. Historically, rental rates in Australia have increased at a manageable pace, but since 2020, they've been skyrocketing by over 8% per year. Today in Australia, the average monthly rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $1,207, over 2 times the global average, making Australia one of the costliest places in the world to rent an apartment. To make matters worse, finding a rental place is also incredibly challenging. The demand for rental units is insatiable, with every available unit receiving dozens, if not hundreds, of applications. At the end of the day, renters are simply fighting for a basic need, a place to live, sleep, and call home. So, why is it this hard? One big issue people often point to in Australia's housing crisis is immigration. Just recently, the government admitted that the migration system is broken and needs a complete overhaul. Between 2022 and 2023, Australia welcomed nearly 800,000 new people. To put that into perspective, that's more immigrants than any year in modern Australian history, and 200,000 more than the levels before COVID-19 hit. So, what does this huge spike in immigration mean for housing? It's pretty straightforward. More people need places to live, but the number of available homes hasn't changed much. This leads to higher prices. Economists and analysts say that migration has mainly impacted rental housing. Most of these immigrants are temporarily visa holders, and about 75% of them rent their homes. This surge in renters has hit hard in areas with large immigrant populations. For instance, Melbourne's southeast and Sydney's inner southwest saw rents jump by 18% in just 1 year. But what about housing construction? You see, the rate of new housing construction has dropped because the cost of building new homes keeps rising. In 2023, only 170,000 dwellings were completed, the lowest number in a decade, just as Australia experienced its biggest spike in immigration in a generation. So, what's going on? One major reason for this decline in housing stats is cultural. Australia is very suburban, with communities preferring urban sprawl over denser living conditions. Many Australians believe suburban environments are ideal for raising families and maintaining safe communities. Thankfully, Australia has a lot of unpopulated land, so theoretically, they can keep building outward and maintain this sprawl. For example, Sydney could add 250,000 homes in its greenfield growth areas. However, there's a big problem with this theory. Australia has a major NIMBY, or not in my backyard issue. Even during an extreme housing crisis, March 2024 saw the lowest number of detached home approvals since 2012. These aren't high-rise condos, they are single-family suburban homes. Strong community advocacy and government red tape lead to extremely long approval times for housing developments. For instance, getting approval for a single home development in New South Wales takes an average of 111 days. Compare this to Texas, where approvals generally take less than a week. These long wait times make it impossible for the government to meet home building targets. Australia is on track to build 40% fewer homes than needed to meet the government's affordable housing goals. The low rate of housing approvals has created an artificial scarcity of land, driving up land prices. Since 2020, home values have risen 3 times faster than apartment prices. As land becomes scarcer and more expensive, it becomes increasingly difficult to acquire and develop land economically. Nevertheless, immigration and low development rates ain't the only factors contributing to Australia's housing crisis. Tax incentives is in fact the biggest problem we need to talk about. So, what are tax incentives? It's basically tax rules encouraging people to invest in property, but they also make housing more expensive for everyone else. Back in the 1930s, Australia had a major housing shortage. To fix this, they wanted to get people to invest in rental properties. So, they introduced a tax rule called negative gearing. Negative gearing lets an investor subtract any losses from a rental property from their personal income. For example, if you make $100,000 a year but lose $10,000 on a rental property, you can deduct that $10,000 from your income. This means you pay less in taxes. This idea is pretty unique. Out of all the countries in the OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, only New Zealand and Japan have similar rules. In the 1980s, the Australian government tried to change these negative gearing rules. They put limits on the deductions that could be claimed, similar to what the UK does. But there was a huge backlash, and negative gearing went back to how it was before. People say you can give, but you can never take, meaning once people get a benefit, they don't want to lose it. At the same time, in the 1980s, the government removed controls on interest rates. This made it cheaper for Australians to borrow money to buy homes. Negative gearing became even more attractive because people could use borrowed money to invest in property. But that's not the only thing making Australia's housing market so intense. You can also hold real estate investments in your retirement account, known as a super. A super is like an IRA in the US. It has significant tax benefits. For example, taxes on rental income are reduced to 15% instead of your regular income tax rate. Unlike in the US, where buying real estate through an IRA is complicated and expensive, it's very easy in Australia and even encouraged. And there's more. In 1999, the Australian government reduced the capital gains tax on real estate sales by 50%. If you hold your property in a super, you only have to pay a 10% tax. Very few countries have such favorable tax rules for property investors. Australia stands out in this regard. These tax policies have been heavily criticized because they benefit landowners and older Australians the most. When 50 to 80% of all investment properties are negatively geared, there's a problem. A system that encourages people to invest in properties that lose money is highly flawed and unusual. This focus on real estate has created another issue. Australia has made it so beneficial to invest in property that people don't invest in other things. Australia's productivity growth has been slowing over the past few decades. Between 2010 and 2020, the average annual labor productivity growth was only 1.1%, much lower than in previous decades. This is partially because there's a lack of innovation and growth in non-service and non-mining sectors in Australia. When you compare business and income taxes, it's clear that Australia favors land ownership over other investments. Average income taxes in Australia are higher than in all but 3 OECD countries. Corporate taxes are also high. Australia's corporate tax is 6.3% higher than the OECD average. And when you compare Australia's small business tax to Canada's, Australia's is 2.5 times higher. Currently, Australia collects a lot of its government revenue from income taxes and corporate taxes, but very little from real estate. The government has incentivized speculation in housing while making it harder to work hard and build productive businesses. The result is an unfair economic system where people hoard land instead of investing in productive activities. Some people might blame political parties for these issues, but the housing crisis in Australia has persisted for decades. Under different governments, housing prices have continued to rise. If you bought a home in 1994 for $1 million, it would be worth $4 million today. Ironically, if you were born after 1994, you probably don't own a home and might never. What do you think can be the solution to Australia's housing crisis? Share your analysis with us in the comments below. If you found this video informative, give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more economic analysis like this. Until next time, share this video with your friends and colleagues.